Substitution is primarily a hazard reduction approach. And so by reducing the hazard, risk itself is fundamentally reduced. Next slide, please. So today, much of the emphasis on chemical substitution has focused, again, as I mentioned just a couple slides ago, on avoiding a specific substance, or now we're actually looking towards avoiding specific classes of substances. We've done less well on considering the function that chemical provides and trying to identify safer alternatives that meet that function. A focus on substitution on function opens up opportunities for the design, as well as the adoption of safer chemicals and technologies to meet the growing demands of downstream users that have both economic, environmental, and health benefits. So this matrix here comes from my colleague here, Joel Tickner, who's with us today, who authored this paper along with several of our colleagues about 10 years ago. And so what we've elevated here is a new approach, not just substitution, but functional substitution. And so take, for example, what you see in the far right-hand column of this matrix, where the example is methylene chloride that's used for the degreasing of metal parts. So often we try, the most common substitution that we do is to try to find a drop-in replacement. So we try to find, for example, another halogenated solvent that almost looks and acts how methylene chloride does. But the problem with this is we often have residual toxicity concerns. And so when we replace methylene chloride, for example, with a compound like 1-bromopropane, we don't alleviate toxicity. We keep it, often having it in different ways. But if you focus on function and ask, is there another way of achieving the process of degreasing, other options open up. For example, the use of ultrasonic technologies as degreasing agents. And if we ask, what can we change at a more systems level? Are there new technologies, for example, of metal cutting that negate the need to use solvents to clean in the first place? So there are options, for example, that are moving down that path. So if we think about function and we think it about at these, various levels, new opportunities for really innovative solutions emerge. Next slide, please. But not all alternatives are safer. And I think most in this audience have heard the term regrettable substitution. And the news is replete with stories of regrettable substitutes when one chemical is banned only to be replaced with another chemical that's just as harmful or potentially worse. We've seen this happen over the years with many different products. We know bisphenol A, for example, is an interconnective substance and appears to be associated with a range of health outcomes, including, for example, endocrine active cancer such as breast cancer. And when states in the US banned the use of BPA and products like baby bottles, manufacturers were really quick to replace the chemical with something very similar to BPA, which we know is our drop-in substitutes like BPS and BPF. These were unregulated, but now we know they are just as endocrine active as BPA. And again, the stories repeated over and over again with a range of different chemicals, from replacing methylene chloride, for example, in a solvent carrier and adhesives with 1-bromopropane. This product was used by workers in the furniture industry. And once this substitution happened, workers quickly started to develop peripheral neuropathy from the exposure to 1-bromopropane. And many of you are familiar with the whack-a-mole game that we played with flame retardants, replacing one halogenated with flame retardant with another, and never solving the toxicity problem by doing so. Next slide, please. So there are ways to address this regrettable substitution issue. And I hope many of you at this point have heard of the field of alternatives assessment. And so this is a process to support what we call informed substitution, not just substitution, but informed substitution, because we're looking to identify and compare and select safer and more sustainable chemicals or alternatives to chemicals of concern on the basis of maximizing those that have the most safe hazard attributes, also related to comparative exposure, but also perform and are economically viable. So we're using this kind of stepwise process of comparing alternatives to maximize their ability to achieve the necessary performance at the with the lowest hazard possible. And this definition, as you see here, actually was published by the National Academies in the United States in 2014. And I want to emphasize that the field has since advanced over the last 9 years or so, and we're seeing other attributes as being really important in this alternatives assessment process, especially other life cycle considerations and sustainability concerns. And Joel's going to speak to this later in the presentation as well. Next slide, please. So alternatives assessment can help us identify safer substitutes, and we know that safer substitutes exist for many functions being served by toxic chemicals. And moreover, new sustainable chemistries are emerging every day to create an ever larger inventory of options. But the challenge is one of adoption or implementing these substitutes. And our work has revealed a number of barriers to the adoption of safer, more sustainable alternatives. As you can see on the left side of the axis here, we call these growth deterrents. And they include factors such as what's green or what's safer, and something that Joel will actually speak to, which inhibits us from knowing, what is actually safer, what does that look like? Or incumbency, as it's difficult for new entrants to compete with lower cost, price, and well-performing chemicals and technologies that are part of a very complex and established supply chains. And of course, price, right? So safer chemicals are often produced in lower volumes and are often more expensive. And small and medium-sized enterprises frequently lack the resources and technical expertise to test the performance of the alternatives and maximize and kind of change and reformulate as necessary, to achieve the necessary, customers' specifications. So it's really important to address these barriers to substitution. It's not enough that we simply identify a safer substitute, but there are really important processes to go through and to support and to convene in order to maximize the ability of these substitutes to be implemented in processes and products going forward. Next slide. And one example of this is a series of case studies that we did to examine adoption and the experience of adoption, what was hindering success or maybe slowing success. And we looked at the issue of alternative plasticizers and used in products such as vinyl tile or PVC toy products, children's toys. And we know, for example, that there are a range of safer alternatives to phthalate plasticizers. And strong drivers such as regulations are really important to motivate change, but it was clear that barriers to adoption must be addressed. And in these examples, it included technical challenges, for example, with reformulation, again, the cost of the substitutes, and the potential for supply chain disruption. A lot of small businesses can't withstand disruption for very long as they retool and create process changes to accommodate the substitute. So sectoral and supply chain collaborations are really needed to overcome these barriers. And, I think NGOs and governments can really play a role in convening these kind of collaborations to make these changes possible. And next slide, please. And so with that, we want to turn this chat over to you all and just ask the question of you, why focus on innovation and adoption of safer and more sustainable chemicals? So we want to hear what your opinion is on this, what your perspective and your experience is on what happens when you focus on kind of the innovation side of substitution, as well as the adoption side. What's been some of your experience? And so let's see what you have to say in the chat.
Thanks very much, Molly. you covered so much, but it was so clear. And I really appreciate that. So just a reminder to be in the chat room, please, to address this question, but also Molly may have raised some questions that you'd like to ask. So feel free to also ask those in the chat. And Molly, you're welcome to stay on and respond to whatever you see coming in the chat. And then we'll shortly go into a poll question.
Great. And I want to say that, my presentation focused a lot on industrial chemicals. But the world of industrial pesticides, all of these issues are very present and very parallel. So, very interested. I think many of you on, joining us today have more experience with pesticides. So, take this question to heart also with regards to your experience with working with pesticides, industrial pesticides. Joel, I don't know if while we're waiting for people to kind of respond to the question here, if you want to expand a little bit more on some of these barriers to adoption that you saw in the, especially in the phthalate example.
Yeah, I mean, I think, well, let me take a step back and say a lot of this thinking here in the resources, you'll see a paper that Molly and I and another colleague drafted for the Global Chemicals Outlook 2 that lays out some of this bigger focus on innovation and adoption. In the end, as Molly was saying, right, let's start with this idea of function. And when you start thinking about function, not the particular chemical, because the chemical provides a service or a function, you can first determine whether that function's even needed, whether that function is overprescribed. As we learned with flame retardants, they weren't needed in a lot of applications, but they were required by law. Or you could start thinking, as Molly laid out, about other options. So if we think about in agricultural chemicals, we were doing some work with the Mexican government and Mexican stakeholders around agroecology as a solution, right? However, those solutions are often more complicated, right? They require more hands-on knowledge. They require a different way of thinking about the problems. They require retraining, and all of those have a cost associated with them. And that's where, there's an inertia question about how we transition or just switching. So in the plasticizers case, if we take, for example, DEHP or diethylhexyl phthalate in IV bags, one of the barriers is procurement. The alternatives cost a little bit more, or a procurement officer has been speccing the same thing from the same supplier for 40 years, and changing that is complicated. There may be retraining because the alternative works slightly differently. We saw this in switching out mercury thermometers in hospitals. The alternatives work differently. They are on a different sized cart. So you have to train to get that adoption. So but cost is often the biggest one. No one wants to pay more, but yet those externalized costs, those direct costs of the chemical of concern, are often not incorporated into the price of the product. So there's a whole set of barriers, but the enablers really are related to, we'll talk about this later, related to some kind of policy or market push. And, as we often say, you don't address chemicals of concern without a supply of safer solutions. So how do we sort of incentivize them into the end? So
Awesome. And I'm seeing a number of people answering that question for themselves, is why focus on innovation and adoption? And many of those in the chat are elevating the issue that it's important because it's about driving better products and processes for our environment and for human health. And also people are raising the connections with things like a circular economy, all part of why we need this transition, and why the innovation side as well as the adoption side is key to kind of helping us move and shape into this direction. Yep, lots of comments about human health protections.
And I think this is a really good one, is innovation allows for a broader assessment of alternatives. It allows for a broader suite of alternatives so that it isn't just the choice between one or two less optimal alternatives, but by opening up that lens of opportunity and innovation, we might find a solution we had never thought about, which really addresses multiple risks at the same time.
Mhm. And one of our participants here has, elevated the economic benefits, right? So one thing that's obviously clear is all the externalities associated with the use of hazardous chemicals. And so, we can really maximize environmental benefits, especially economic benefits with regard to environmental and human health, by making these transitions.
Yep. Definitely the point of, designing out from the beginning as we sort of think about, and this is something we've certainly been doing with chemists and engineers, is how do we train those who are designing systems, agricultural scientists, chemists, engineers, to think about how to design a system that designs out the problems in the first place. And that's a different type of training and capacity building that's needed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the education side is absolutely key. Training the next generation of chemical engineers and chemists, to embrace many of the principles of toxicology, so we can fundamentally design these chemistries to be, that safety is a performance requirement.
I mean, one thing that I see here is, right, barriers to smaller countries are that they're not producers, they're importers. So innovation is difficult. There was some great work from the United Nations Environment Program in the 1990s on sustainable product design. And one thing we heard at a Beyond 2020 ICCM workshop last week is really harnessing local knowledge and local technologies. And this is work that was done by UNEP in the 1990s, looking at local sustainable product design. So leveraging local materials, leveraging local traditions and local technologies to build more sustainable products. And we've in some ways lost that vision and need to bring it back.
Mm-hmm.
So leveraging the resources of smaller countries and the knowledge base of smaller countries.
I'm seeing, in the poll when we asked you all, what you are experiencing as the biggest barriers, people are talking about the issue of intersectorial collaboration, and it's hard. Collaboration is absolutely hard, and Joel will actually provide an example of this that also, I think, later in our time together, that also speaks to other barriers that I'm seeing here. Meaning that many in your country, you aren't producers of chemicals, but rather downstream users. And so, trying to identify the resources to support substitution from a downstream user perspective is also quite difficult. And again, Joel will present a case. For example, we are at our university, the University of Massachusetts Lowell. We're in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is also not a heavy producer of chemicals, but rather a user of chemicals. But there's a lot of experience to draw from, and how collaboration actually can work. The roles, whether it's the provision of support and funding or technical assistance, or just playing a convening role, bringing people together to have dialogue, to identify alternatives, to speak to the barriers around adoption, can really open up solutions to make these things happen. And Joel will speak more to that.
Yeah, there's a good question here about how do we think about addressing those externalities at an economy level. And that's very difficult, because putting a price sometimes on damage to ecosystems and health is quite difficult. So we were working on a project for the state of California about how to leverage economic incentives to both create a disincentive to hazardous activities, but also create an incentive for more sustainable activities, and that's, it's sort of what you might call a bonus malus, right? You incentivize the good, you tax the bad, and those schemes do exist, and I think that that's going to be necessary to do more of that.
Yeah, it feels like there's more and more examples that are starting to pop up that, that try to serve getting the polluter to pay, and incentivizing the good. Yeah, so we're interested to hear your responses to this next poll around innovations that you've experienced to address, specific toxic chemical issues in your country. What new solutions have you identified?
And these don't necessarily have to be innovations that are chemical substitutes or new technologies. They could be innovations in policy to get, or education, ways that, you're sort of driving, this transition away from hazardous chemicals and towards safer, more sustainable chemicals and products and activities.
Mm-hmm. And I think we see one, our colleague here from Iran, that, yeah, the issue of education and knowledge, enhancing knowledge about opportunities and alternatives, but doing it in the language, of your target audience is really key. Knowledge sharing. I know we've had a lot of experience of just doing fact sheets, and there's a number of resources even through the OECD to support the identification of alternatives for a range of functions. So that knowledge sharing is key. Drones for pesticide application. That's interesting. Can you scroll up? I want to see if there's some, there we go. Yes, integrated pest management is often heralded as a key alternative to industrial chemicals. Trying to use pesticides as the least resort, and working in a more biodynamic way to deal with pests in agricultural settings. We use this often in the United States, both in urban and agricultural settings as well. And yes, organic agriculture is key to kind of reducing our dependency on synthetic toxic pesticides. So I think we have time to think through a couple more, and then we're going to transition on to the next part.
I think one thing that came up last week at the Beyond 2020 International Conference on Chemicals Management preparatory meeting is the idea of a maturity ladder. So a high aspiration, but really meeting countries where they're at in terms of capacity, in terms of understanding, and then really building up that ladder. So doing chemical substitution is quite hard if there's not basic chemicals management understanding. So it's really building up from there, and then again, as we heard, leveraging local tradition, local knowledge that are important.
Yeah, and our colleague from Tunisia, eliminating a number of different chemicals, but there's always resistance, to do the switch. This is common. And one solution that we've experienced, to this is sometimes not, just sharing information is not enough. It's really important to do more like peer mentoring, if you will, like using businesses or experience to make the switch, inviting people to see how it performs, what it looks like. This has been key for us, for example, in the realm of dry cleaning, and the transition into wet cleaning, where you invite people to experience how the new technology works. And that can kind of help to, overcome these barriers to the transition, because they're just used to using what they're used to using, right? We've got to overcome that together.
Right. And I think Andrea raises a good point, is like always having in place a good process for evaluating the pros and cons of alternatives, the technology implications at a health and safety and a societal level, bringing up GMOs as an example. We're seeing something very similar as we start looking at alternatives or engineered nanomaterials, which are for example, a replacement to PFAS, to the perfluorinated substances. And will those just shift the risks to another challenge we'll have later on down the line?
Mm-hmm. What I'm also just seeing on these examples of innovations, there are so many examples from the agricultural and pesticide setting of functional substitution.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than, if the key is to deal with, the mosquito carrying, those that are carrying malaria, nets, right? There's so many other kind of functional substitutes that will help relieve the burden of these malaria carrying mosquitoes. Or I'm loving the examples of using robots in expensive. This is from one of our Canadian colleagues, to help pick weeds rather than the use of pesticides. Lots of examples here of functional substitutes. Well,
thank you. Yes, you've stimulated the conversation, so we can definitely move on to the next one. But do you want to have any concluding thoughts? I know you've covered quite a lot of things.
No, I think, we are really, there's deep experience in our participants today of what functional substitution means, what innovation can look like, and acknowledging that substitution is hard. But collaborations and working together to overcome these barriers are what we need to do to make this transition happen. So yeah, let's move on, Andrea. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks, Molly. Then over to you, Joel.
Great, thank you. And then what I'm going to do is then talk about where do we go from there, right? How do we define better? I think that was the first slide. I may have hit the button. Let's see here. That was the first side of that part, right? So how do we define the right direction, defining better? And we do have tools for defining safer. This is some work we did with OECD to define a safer chemical, right? What are the minimum criteria? What do you need to know to say it's safer? And what would be ideal to define it safer? And I see that Eva from OECD is on this call. As Molly said, we're moving beyond that, right? Investors, others, the UN Sustainable Development Goals take on a broader set of criteria. And if you go to the next slide, that would be great. What other criteria do we need to think about, right? What other attributes as we're shifting and moving towards better or away from problem chemicals and materials to better ones? There's all of the sustainable development goals. So we might think about, right, it's got to be safer, right? It can't be more toxic because that's what we're starting with. But what other factors do we need to think about, right? Upstream and downstream toxicity. So maybe it's safer at the use phase, but it requires a highly hazardous chemical to make it upstream somewhere, or it ends up in a waste product that ends up in an open landfill somewhere. So it may be safer in the use phase, but it may end up being burned somewhere in an industrializing country. What are the natural resource impacts, right? As we move away from petrochemical based products to plant-based, are there biodiversity and natural resource impacts? And increasingly, investors are very focused on climate and biodiversity. So if we are moving towards a solution that has significant biodiversity impacts, for example, a decision by our U.S. Department of Defense to move towards biofuels meant significant rainforest damage to get palm oil in Indonesia. There's a direct linkage. So we need to be really careful as we move away from problem chemistry to alternatives to make sure that we're not trading off one problem for another, whether it be water, social justice impacts, right? So maybe we're moving towards an alternative that requires a mineral of concern that is mined in a conflict area. So what are those, and how do we think about them without getting too bogged down in paralysis by analysis, right? How do we think about those more broadly? But ultimately, we're trying to move towards better. So we always think about alternatives assessment once a decision to substitute has come in. And then the question is, what do we need to weigh as trade-offs so that we're not making a regrettable substitution beyond safety? Next slide, please. So in the European Union, one of the goals of the chemical strategy for sustainability is to advance safe and sustainable by design chemicals. So ultimately, the starting point, because REACH or the chemical strategy is about safer or safe chemicals. So the first starting point is safe. Now we can start looking at the life cycle or beyond that and say, is it sustainable? Does it have climate impact? Does it have pollution impacts? Does it have safety impacts, right? For example, we did work many years ago looking at bio-based replacements to chemicals of concern. And it turned out in the fermentation processes, there were some pretty nasty reagents you had to use. So if those weren't taken into account, you might miss them. Or for example, we were working with a company that was making a mushroom-based, mycelium-based packaging material, but there was no health and safety consideration for the workers who were taking live mycelium and putting it into mold. So no respiratory protection. So again, we want to look holistically at the trade-offs we're making, be very open about them, and try to design out or at least address those problems as we're transitioning to better alternatives. So as you can see from this matrix, there's ways to do that in a very disaggregated way, right? There's a tool called life cycle assessment, which can quantify those trade-offs. However, often, much as in the case of risk assessment, we crumple a lot of information into a number and we lose track of those nuances, the trade-offs that we're making, so that we can see them and array them right here, as in this matrix, so we can see, oh, this one might be much better, much safer, but it's not very good for climate change. Well, okay, is that climate impact intrinsic to the molecule, or is it because the feedstock for that molecule is made in a country that still uses coal for energy, right? So we can start looking more broadly about those and then say, how do we address that? Next slide, please. So we've defined in some of our work, we brought together a multi-stakeholder group globally, including one scientist from Africa, to start saying, well, what's the direction? How do we define where we want to go with chemical substitution? And we're calling that sustainable chemistry, right? So it's the development and application of chemicals, chemical processes, products, and activities. We didn't add activities in there that benefit current and future generations without harmful effects to humans or ecosystems. And if you start looking at these criteria or areas of criteria that need to be met to say this is sustainable, well, we start with equity and justice. Does it address community impact? Does it trade off impact from one community to another? Are the innovations being developed addressing those communities that have been most impacted by chemical pollution? How do we engage those communities more effectively? Transparency. So we need good information to be able to make decisions. It can't be sustainable if we know nothing about it, right? We have to know something to be able to assess it in the trade-off. And then these other areas, which we certainly have talked about, health and safety, right? It can't be toxic. You can't switch off one toxic thing for another toxic thing. Circularity. We want it to be degradable at end of life. We want it to be reusable, recyclable. And then lastly, climate and ecosystem impact, right? It's not sustainable if it leads to significant impacts on biodiversity. It's not sustainable if it negatively impacts workers or harms workers. So we start with that sort of North Star of where we want to be, and then we can evaluate a chemical process, technology, or activity against these criteria. Again, the first step is asking the questions. So for example, some of the companies we're working with may be trying to find a better plastic for their products, and they're saying, well, we can move to a recycled or circular version of this one we're using, but that one may be made out of a carcinogen. And then you might ask the question, well, where are the monomers, where are the building blocks for that plastic made, and what does it do to communities in that area where that is being made? Is that sustainable, right? If it harms communities somewhere along its value chain or along its life cycle, is that a sustainable solution? So really taking a broad lens to evaluate those solutions to chemicals, but again, we may not have great data for each of these. So we want to sort of look at them in a almost a question asking way, and having criteria more effectively to evaluate those aspects. Next slide, please. And here's some ways companies are doing this, companies and other organizations. So if you take, for example, Solvay, I think this is Solvay's sustainability portfolio assessment, you can see they come up with ways to evaluate the trade-offs within their chemical portfolio to say, okay, this is where this one's better for climate change, but worse for toxicity, or more water needed to make it, or this has a bigger impact on human health. So it's really, as much as possible, arraying and almost dashboarding those trade-offs, because there's always going to be a trade-off. And the question is, are we understanding those trade-offs? Are we minimizing or recognizing those trade-offs? And are we minimizing those trade-offs? So, downstream company Reckitt has a sustainable innovation calculator where they're looking at these different trade-offs in terms of health or water or carbon or toxicity of ingredients. There's certification schemes like the Cradle to Cradle product scorecard, which looks at a set of factors of material health or material utilization or energy or water, and then can say, oh, it's good in this, it's not so good in that. Is this a trade-off that we're willing to take? This requires more water. Well, how do we minimize the water use to do this? So it's really thinking about the pros and the cons more holistically of those, or more comprehensively of those solutions. Next slide, please. So let's get to that question. How do we know we're transitioning to safer, more sustainable chemicals and practices? How do we assess that? How do we know so that we don't result in a regrettable substitution? And arguably, we're probably going to make mistakes. We've made them for millennia. But how do we get the most knowledge we possibly can to the table to minimize the possibility of those trade-offs? So we'll let you put some thoughts in the chat now about how do we know? What are the ways you're doing this in your own work of assessing alternatives? How are you understanding potential trade-offs? How are you looking at those solutions and making sure that you're not solving one problem while possibly creating a new problem?
And you've raised a lot of important issues, Joel. So if participants have any questions, please do feel free to put those in the chat as well. And as we saw in the beginning, you represent different stakeholder groups. So it would be quite nice to see from the different stakeholder groups, industry, NGOs, academia, what your thoughts are about this question of transitioning to safer and more sustainable chemicals. And I'll see you in the chat room.
As you dig into this question, where we don't have great knowledge or great information or the tools, how are we doing this? Or how do we do this? Or who do we need to connect with to do this more effectively? Right? It might be difficult if there's not clear metrics or indicators, right? So what are those indicators that we might be able to have? You know, when I was studying, my good friend Mary O'Brien, who my mentor, who was the chair of the board of the Pesticide Action Network globally, she wrote a book called Making Better Environmental Decisions: An Alternative Risk Assessment. And she said, you know, very simply, it's you know, identify a wide range of options, assess the pros and cons of those options in as holistic a way, using the approaches we often use in an environmental impact assessment. And then lastly, you know, how do we weigh those?
I'm seeing, Joel, a real conflict where there's growing knowledge of information around this, but still the annual increase of chemicals being produced and imported is ever growing, right? So, we're trying to counteract this by, using this safer and sustainable by design approach, but we're still dealing with, very cheap, very good acting in terms of performance chemicals that are being imported at ever increasing volumes.
And I like the idea of reduced chemical induced health issues. And I would call that a lagging indicator. It's often too late by the time we get that, unless it's direct poisonings have gone down versus, lower rates of cancer and all the other confounding factors that come in. Epidemiology, unfortunately, and Molly's the epidemiologist here, is not the strongest science to measure, whether we're going in the right direction.
There's just too much latency involved to have it be a quick indicator of change. It might help us 10 or 15 years out, but it won't help us tomorrow to know if we're heading in the right direction. Lots of comments around benchmarks and indicators, and also consumer demand. I don't know if you want to speak to that, Joel.
Yeah, I mean, consumer demand is really important. We've certainly seen that within our change chemistry network, that there's very good data that consumers are increasingly buying products that have either claims or certifications of being safer. We've seen this for years in the organic foods movement being the fastest growing segment of food. The fastest growing segment of the health and beauty products area is clean beauty. So we know that there is increasing demand from consumers. That is really key. Certainly we can look at sales as an indicator that we're moving in the right direction. Decreases in quantities. I mean, that is certainly, when we talk about our work in Massachusetts, we have use data at a factory level. So we can actually see if the amount of chemicals used per unit of product is reducing. So we can say, oh, we reduced the use of this chemical by 42% over a 5-year period. So having real good metrics is useful.
Mm-hmm. I'm seeing a comment about, the role of regulations and policies, and you'll see in the next part, it's key that, regulations are necessary, but ultimately insufficient to support what we want, right? They're good at stopping the bad. They're less good at promoting the good, about helping us figure out with incentives and otherwise the directions that we need to head. Yeah, regulations are an important metric, I think, to drive change, to create that motivation for change, but we still need more work on what we're going to move towards instead.
Yeah, I mean, a good point, right, is it's sustainable when it can be produced in sufficient quantities and environmental health impacts are acceptable. And then we could have a long discussion about how we define acceptable, right? For example, in the US, often you hear regulators talking about acceptable risk. Well, acceptable risk is not a scientific judgment. It's a social judgment that was made by the courts or made by policymakers, not scientists or the public.
Jill, do you want to make any comments on the poll before we move to the next one?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I think there are, right, looking at persistence, looking at effectiveness, all of these we'd have to sort of see like effectiveness in terms of addressing a pest infestation, right? So effectiveness is an important one, right? If the chemical doesn't work, if the process change doesn't work, it's not going to solve the problem. So as a starting point, an alternative has to work, right? And it has to be cost effective, or else it's never going to be adopted, right? So that's pretty key. You know, getting information from outside the country as you know, from suppliers is important, though again, this question of do we trust the information, right? Because trust is a really critical part to all of this, right? Is there and the same happens in a place like the United States, right? Who's going to trust the chemical supplier that their alternative is safer, right? A third party might be the best way to do that, that can independently verify that information.
Joel, I'm seeing an interesting comment here about the issue of uncertainty, and you know, how do we really know, right? We can have all these metrics to test against safety and sustainability, but you know, you started that presentation by, we can easily go down paralysis by analysis before we choose to adopt something. So how do we deal with these residual uncertainties while still you know, making you know, evolving, as it were?
Yeah, I think there's multiple approaches. We've certainly done this in our work, working on the precautionary principle. Is how do you address those uncertainties? Is it through having a group of experts come together, what we might call a Delphi approach, to get the best knowledge people to say, oh, I'm pretty sure that this is this. Is there a sensitivity analysis that can be done? We're almost always, especially when dealing with a new activity, a new chemical, dealing with uncertainty. So, you know, when we're dealing with toxicity, there are new approach methods or rapid screens that can be done to identify at least red flags of toxicity. When you're dealing with climate or biodiversity, it's getting the best minds and asking that question. There's no simple way to reduce uncertainty, and typically, you know, if it's something new, it's going to have more uncertainty than something that we've worked with for a long time. But that doesn't mean that the thing we've worked with for a long time is safer. It just means that there's greater uncertainty. So what can we do to reduce that uncertainty before we go in the direction? And that a lot of that has to do with not just making a decision and being done, but making a decision and monitoring it for early warnings of potential unintended consequences, so you can address those quite quickly.
And that piece of things, just the continuing monitoring, is something that is inherent in the alternatives assessment process and after implementation, right? To invoke monitoring systems to catch problems early as they might arise. We know already that most of all the alternatives that we have at this moment in time are not inherently benign by design. We're going in that direction, but there will always be, issues that we still have to resolve, and trade-offs that we need to identify solutions for. So that continuous monitoring is really important.
Yeah, this is good to see what people are saying about mechanisms to use, whether progress is being made. Frankly, in Europe and the United States, we also lack those mechanisms. We have very good data in the state of Massachusetts because we collect that information on chemical use, waste, emissions at a manufacturer level, so we can measure that. But our data, for example, at the national level to understand whether there is a growth in safer chemicals, and EPA has a definition for safer chemicals. It's nearly impossible because the data bands are so big, from 1 ton to 1 million tons. So it's all noise if you see growth of a better chemical. So you could measure by new policies, for example. That's one way. You could measure by sales. You could measure by decreases in harmful chemicals. You could measure maybe by patents, but that just tells you about whether the innovation occurred, not whether that innovation was adopted.
So before we move on to the next question, do you want to make any comments, either of you, on the poll? I think you've covered some of it.
Yeah,
I want to make any more.
I think the bottom line is we don't have good data. We don't have really great mechanisms to evaluate beyond whether it's safer. But having at least some basic approach, even if it's just asking questions to try and understand trade-offs beforehand, and then having some metrics. I was raising this as well in the context of the Beyond 2020 last week, is just the simple fact of understanding, as was in the chat, of understanding what you're working with, how much you're working with, where it's going, and then being able to measure that is a good step at better chemicals management and toxics reduction. What we often find in Massachusetts is when companies realize how inefficient they're actually using chemicals, it leads to almost immediate process design changes that save money.
Great, thank you. So I think we'll move on to the final question and the final sort of input
Great.
that you have for us. This is great. You can see you're stimulating lots of thought. So thank you.
Well, now comes the hard part, right? Which is, what do we do to increase that adoption of safer, more sustainable chemicals, materials, and practices? Again, the starting point here is, how do we advance safe and sustainable chemicals, materials, and practices that reduce the chemicals of concern? Because in the end, it's very difficult to reduce the use of the chemicals of concern if we don't have better alternatives that are at scale and adopted. So that's the end goal. I think we can all agree to that. So next slide. So then the question is, how do we get there, right? And we might start with thinking about policy, because policy is really important. And if we're thinking about innovation policy, there's two parts to it, right? We need policy that really puts pressure on the chemicals of concern. So what we might call willingness, and willingness is created by either policy pressure or market pressure. Doesn't tend to happen organically, but that would be restrictions, planning requirements, purchasing policies, create the willingness. But willingness alone, the fact that government says you need to get out of it, doesn't necessarily in and of itself lead to innovations. As Molly demonstrated earlier, if I'm a small metal finisher and I can't use this chemical, I go to my supplier and I say, what's a drop-in that works that isn't regulated? And I might get something that is just as toxic, but just not regulated. So we need to have that capacity as well. And that capacity includes technical assistance, information, R&D support, education, tax incentives, right? So willingness, capacity, and then opportunity, right? You need to create opportunities to drive that innovation as well. Next slide, please. So as I said, in work we've done for European Union, for the Canadian government, in the US, we know that regulation is key to driving innovation. There's plenty of literature that shows that policy drives innovation. But policy, when it's linked with support and incentives, what we might call carrots and sticks. So the stick is the restriction, the carrot is the incentive, right, to pull us towards it. So we need push policy and pull policy. So it's not just about getting rid of the bad, we need that, but we need to support it with support, collaboration, and capacity building to do better. And that's all part of those three parts, right? It's about push, capacity, and then collaboration. All three of those are necessary. And I'm going to give some examples in a second. So next slide, please. So we know there's a range of what we might call pull policies or incentive policies. And what we need to do more effectively is link those to priorities. If our priority is to get rid of highly hazardous pesticides, how do we create the incentives or the pull to drive away from the highly hazardous pesticides and towards more sustainable forms of agriculture? Well, one is research, right? Funding basic R&D, applied R&D, piloting and scaling new approaches, using research institutes and government labs. US, we have very big government labs. So how do we leverage those or leverage private or public research institutes more effectively? How do we give credits and incentives? For example, we built our renewable energy economy in the United States. So for example, solar, through tax incentives and credits. It's how we're going to drive electric vehicle use in the United States, is through tax incentives and credits. We need to make those alternatives cheaper or as cheap as the incumbents. Otherwise, it's going to be very difficult to get them adopted. In certain cases, people will pay more, for example, for organic agriculture. People will pay more for organic foods than traditional, but not always. Preferential procurement. So governments carry a lot of purchasing power. They buy, millions, if not billions of dollars of stuff. Large organizations buy lots of stuff. So how do we change the way purchasing is done? Or how do we recognize safer, more sustainable chemicals and products? For example, in the United States, we have a program called Safer Choice, which is it's a program of the Environmental Protection Agency that recognizes cleaning and other household products that have safer chemicals in them. And because it's a government recognition, there's strong support across from chemical companies to brands to NGOs for driving better, right? Because everyone wants safer, more sustainable. And the question then is, how do we make that happen? Workforce development is really important, as well as transition funding for workers or communities that may be impacted by a transition to more sustainable forms of production. For example, when we wanted to protect redwoods in the United States, in Northern California, right, the loggers made their money cutting down redwood trees. How do we actually retain those loggers and transition those communities from extractive to protective economies? And it was very successful by really understanding the transition and supporting that transition. And then clearly direct technical support. So there is a need, and this is why UNIDO, UN Industrial Development Organization, UNEP, set up what are called cleaner production centers around the world, which is centers that could provide direct technical support to companies, to farmers, and support for really adopting more sustainable chemicals and practices. But the other thing governments can do or academic institutions, research institutions, is really bring together people for consortia that will solve problems together, right? Bring together different minds. And I'm going to give an example of that in a second. Next slide, please. But let me give you an example here from Massachusetts. So in Massachusetts, we have what's called the Toxic Use Reduction Institute. I was the director of it for a couple of years. But TURI was created under a 1989 law called the Toxic Use Reduction Act in Massachusetts, which requires that manufacturing firms annually understand their chemicals use and their throughput, how it's going into product waste emissions. Every 2 years, they have to do an assessment of alternatives that would reduce the amount of chemical use per unit of output. They pay a fee on chemicals, a small fee, that then funds the regulatory program, a voluntary technical assistance program, but then a research and education program at University of Massachusetts at Lowell. And what we do is not only train the people who are doing these toxic use reduction plans, but we also help those companies to understand their hazardous chemicals. We help them to assess alternatives. We help them to evaluate and test alternatives. So one example is we were able to reduce the use of trichloroethylene, a solvent used in metal degreasing, by 90%, mostly by testing the alternatives for small companies, small, medium-sized companies, metal finishers, electronics companies. So really understanding what they needed to clean, for example, degrease, and then finding alternatives that would work in their production and taking away the technical risk to adoption. Whereas our environmental protection agency is just finishing their risk management measures for a chemical we've known for 40 years is carcinogenic, we worked to find alternatives from day one that were a win for the companies. They were a win for health and environment. They reduced the long-standing multi-decade debates over the toxicity of trichloroethylene and led to, in the most cases, safer solutions. In the European Union, for example, the restriction on TCE under REACH led many manufacturing firms to switch from TCE to perchloroethylene, which we see as a regrettable substitute because they weren't thinking about those solutions. They didn't have the support to evaluate those safer alternatives. So having that kind of assessment and technical support to evaluate alternatives that takes away technical risks to substitution is a good way to transition companies. And then lastly, we fund and conduct research to develop and test safe and effective and affordable alternatives. So let me give you an example on the next slide. Next slide, please. So what we tried to do is bring together consortia, right? One consortia we brought was companies we found like to work together to solve problems, whereas many people would say companies don't want to share their information. Our experience from TURI and Change Chemistries, companies actually like to work together in a pre-competitive space to solve problems. They like to share their successes, but learn from each other to solve problems. So in one case, we brought together companies, academic institutions, and government agencies to solve the problem of a chemical of concern, hexavalent chromium, which is used as a coating on, for example, airplanes, ships. It's rust resistant, it's salt resistant, but it is also a carcinogen. So how do we find and adopt and evaluate those better alternatives in a pre-competitive way so everyone wins and shares in that process? So the next slide. So we brought together government agencies, we brought together companies. They shared their testing and research capacities. We facilitated the consortium that not only evaluated the hazards of the alternatives, but then tested those alternatives in the actual machinery used by those aerospace companies. So we tested to reduce the technological risk to companies in a pre-competitive way. Again, everyone won by having a better anti-corrosion coating. So this is one example, right, of where we can bring together stakeholders in a pre-competitive space to solve a problem. Let me give you another example. Next slide, please. So we worked with the Dutch government, but also a nonprofit in Washington State called Northwest Green Chemistry, worked with Washington State to find safe and sustainable anti-fouling coatings for recreational and other boat craft. One of the challenges is that to keep barnacles and other growth from the bottom of ships, we often use highly toxic or aquatically toxic chemicals. For example, tributyl tin or then copper, which are toxic to aquatic wildlife. We know that being able to keep barnacles or other buildup on the bottom of ships is important, not only for ensuring that we don't move invasive species from one part of the planet to another part of the planet, but also that buildup increases drag on the ship, which increases fuel use, which has a climate impact. So we want to keep that buildup off the ships. Next slide. So taking the functional substitution approach, in both cases, we could say there are diverse mechanisms for managing fouling, right? We can take a biocidal approach, which is something that kills barnacles or other, and we can find other ways to do that. We can take other approaches that would kill barnacles, kill snails, kill algae or other buildup. Or we could take a non-biocidal approach, which might be several approaches. One would be a coating, including a coating that might have ultraviolet built into it. We could take a sound-based or a sonar-based approach, or we could take a mechanical, for example, just washing the bottoms of boats or tarps. And then we can look at the pros and cons of those options, whether it be a coating, a biocidal, or other. But important to this, and we can go to the next slide, is making sure that a broad range of stakeholders are involved in that process, because that increases results. As we're doing chemical substitution, as we're thinking about the adoption, we need to have those who are impacted by that technology change as part of it. What we learned, for example, in substituting mercury in hospitals in Mexico and Ecuador was that if nurses aren't involved, they'll reject the change. And also that those changes do have an impact on work practices. So those workers have to be involved. One of our colleagues, Margaret Quinn, developed an approach called P2OSH, which is an approach for piloting and testing of alternatives in the situ, in their place, using the actual workers to understand what are the trade-offs, what are the needs for adoption to improve that. And that requires a broader engagement of stakeholders here. In the case of anti-fouling, for example, we needed boat owners or marinas to be involved, because ultimately they're the ones who will adopt it. And who do they listen to? Well, in the Netherlands, it turns out it's like Recreational Mariner magazine. So if we get something published in Recreational Mariner magazine that says these are effective, they work well, then that helps. So it builds up deeper understanding. It improves the range of options you look at. It improves access to expertise and data, which ultimately enhances your ability to find a better alternative and get better adoption. So stakeholder engagement is really key from what we found from the Washington State and our own effort of how do we drive adoption of better alternatives. So we'll go to the next slide here, and I think we're at the questions. Well, just here's our information. It's in the slides. We're happy to engage with all of you. So next slide. And then also the resources are there that we have. But here are the questions. Let's start with this one, and then we'll open the polls. How do we accelerate innovation adoption of safer, more sustainable chemistry and practices? What are the best ways to do that? What lessons do you have about how do you get better adoption in your own places, in your own countries, for example, of bio-based pesticides or alternative agricultural practices? What are the ways we can learn? Because ultimately we want to learn from different sectors about what works to drive solutions that are cross-sectoral, lessons about cross-sectoral collaboration. So Andrea, thoughts, questions, and then please do put your questions in there too.
You've given us a lot of food for thought, and I'm grateful that you've given some examples, because I think that's what's important. I think really what's key is the trigger. What's the trigger? Who's the trigger to start this process? And is it legislation? Is it an outcry from civil society or consumers that there's harmful chemicals? And I don't think there's one trigger, as what you've been saying, that there are multiple triggers. But when I reflect on in low and middle income countries like African countries, what is the trigger?
Yeah, there's where there's not regulation, what is the trigger? I mean, it could be just concern raised by authorities, but is that going to be enough to drive action, right? I mean, that might take as we heard in the chat, right? How do we engage those stakeholders and sectors, because everyone, I think generally we all want to do better. We all want innovation and more safer, more sustainable practices. What we found in working with companies is they just didn't know, right? That awareness building where they're like, oh, I can save money by doing this. I didn't even think about that. So how do you build that awareness?
This notion I'm just seeing from Leah, stakeholder engagement. Communities themselves are critical experts in their craft and have a lot of insights on what works, what doesn't work. It's the idea of testing alternatives in situ, as Joel mentioned. So, looking to communities for ideas on solutions. I mean, they're the key stakeholders, is really important. They know what's harmful, and they also know what other options, that might be viable.
Right. And I think it's not just within a country, it's how do you get that cross-country lessons learned about what works, right? Is that global NGOs that help do that? Is it UNEP that helps do it? Is it UNIDO that helps do it? But really, when you see it can work, when you see successes, how do you build on those?
Yeah. Lots of comments on the importance of collaboration across sectors, between governments, amongst communities.
Raising awareness, just basic awareness. Mm-hmm.
Also the importance of research, and translating that research and doing it in a collaborative way. There's a lot of models. That model that Joel mentioned about the collaborative, testing, performance testing, that's a key example of, including businesses, including research institutes, including government agencies, all working together to, on solutions focused research, not necessarily always working on the problem together, but working on the solutions together.
Yeah, and there's certainly our colleague at the University of Gothenburg, Daniel Slunga, who we've worked with, who's an economist, has worked with African economists, environmental economists, creating a network to sort of think about, incentives. So how do we build networks of networks that really try to both drive the incentives, but also the collaborations? How do we leverage academic and research institutes in our work? We've identified just amazing work coming out of research institutes in industrializing countries. And how do we build that knowledge from those research institutes to, often, resource limited government agencies and other types of activities? Yeah, so just having national science and technology councils, so really engaging them to help drive innovations and more sustainable chemicals and practices.
Joel, I'm looking at answers to the poll question here, and lots mirror what you just said about Daniel Schlong's work in Africa, looking for a range of policy incentives, from R&D support to tax breaks. The bonus malus, as you mentioned earlier, falls into this category. There's
highlighting the costs, right? Getting data on the real costs of these impacts to economies, right? Because often we don't understand those full costs. Right. So, right. I think this is a good point, right? This point about making sure we're not sending the old technologies to industrializing countries, because then, we just have shifted the problem somewhere else. And that needs to be, how does global policy, how does global action make sure that, the Africa doesn't become the dumping ground for technologies and chemicals that are, no longer needed elsewhere.
I think the role, we see one here about the role of recognition of the good of companies that have made change. We have also examples of that where EPA in the United States, issues green chemistry awards to companies. And so recognition, for brand, recognition as an increasing market as a result of that recognition, scaling that impact is often done using those types of strategies.
Yeah, and then, definitely, how do we leverage some of the global work that's being done to put pressure on multinational companies that do have the power to make sure that their operations in African countries and Asian countries are using the most sustainable chemistries, are leveraging that, and certainly the experience of the ZDHC, Zero Discharge of Hazardous Chemicals Initiative, which was really formed because Greenpeace tested the effluent of those facilities in China for brands like Nike, Adidas, Levi's Group, and found they were polluting waterways the same way they had in our Merrimack River in Lowell, Massachusetts 100 years ago. So how do we sort of, create that accountability upstream to, make sure then that the capacity building is being driven by those who are benefiting from the chemistry and the products being made. Political will is the first step, right? We need political will.
So I note we have 4 minutes left, so I encourage people to post quickly.
Yeah.
We could carry on quite easily, but I think, this is an important starting conversation for getting different stakeholders to think about these issues. And then, for us to introduce them into our academic programs in low and middle income countries, and for governments to start discussing these in terms of policies and legislation.
Yeah, and I think always having examples is so good, because it shows what's possible. It shows what's feasible. So the more examples we have of success stories, of collaborations, of even failures are helpful to understand, well, what went wrong? What can we learn from that failure to not repeat it? So having both success stories and lessons learned are really important to build momentum.
Yes, I agree, very much so.
Better collaboration globally on this is key. Mm-hmm.
No, I was just going to say, would you like to make any concluding statements or comment on what's popping up at the moment on the screen?
Yeah, I think I see this strengthening connections with research centers, better collaboration, coordination, better stakeholder engagement, awareness, all of those are key, right? It's not, this isn't easy, right? If it were easy, we'd be doing it all the time already. So I think the message we wanted to bring today is that, having alternatives is hopeful, right? It provides a direction to solving problems rather than, just debating the problems. And that's a good thing. And that takes resources to be put towards solving problems. And we're seeing a lot of engagement here. And well, how do we do this better? And I think that's the challenge, but the opportunity as well.
And Molly, any last thoughts from you?
No, but it just feels like this community of practice shares the similar perspective and experience that we do around the solutions needed and the steps, the immediate steps to progress this transition. So I I think this community of practice is well on its way. So appreciate the time to be, spending the time here with you all today and engaging on this global issue where we need global solutions and collaborations for the change needed. So thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you for taking of your time. You have given a lot of food for thought to our participants. And also, I think the fact that it's a diverse stakeholder group, it will infiltrate into different stakeholders. So thank you for that. Thank you for bearing with us with technical problems, but thanks to Eunice and Naomi in the background. We do have a couple of poll questions. If you could please take a moment to respond to those. Make sure you've signed up for the community of practice if you want to get the digest and the slides. And we also have a newsletter that we put out every few weeks with various resources and editorials. So please also sign up for that. And just to let you know that our next discussion will be on the 8th of August, and we'll be speaking about clean lighting and mercury. So we're moving on to another example of innovation specifically with mercury. So thank you again to everyone. Please reach out to the presenters if you have further questions, and also look at the resources that were provided with you. Molly, Joel, have a great day, and thanks very much for your time.
Thank you so much, Andrea.
Be well, everyone.
Thanks. Bye to you all.